Their envy and jealousy was beyond evil.
The consciousness is beginning to gradually spread with the wind. Blacks are beginning to stir up, questioning outrightly, burdened by hurting memories passed down to them from older generations who were present in the horrible event of the destruction of these prosperous cities. More horrible than words it is.
And they say black people never try to get ahead? Black people aren't entrepreneurial? We were the original entrepreneurs before all of the other immigrant groups.
My grandmother is from Thomasville, Arkansas. Her town was destroyed when she was a kid, and she had PTSD from it until she passed away at the age of 88 in 2010.
What I don't understand, they didn't want us to integrate their neighborhoods. Then why destroy the neighborhoods that we built?
I met the survivors of the Philadelphia destruction 9 years back in 1998, and they were still shell-shocked.
In the shadow of America's troubled past, a sinister force fueled the destruction of thriving black communities. Hate, segregation, and racism had ignited a fire of envy, targeting self-sufficient black towns and cities. The result was devastating. Once vibrant neighborhoods reduced to ghost towns in a wink of an eye. Their stories silenced by violence and oppression. Welcome to another video segment where we continue the journey into one of America's darkest histories of black ghost towns, which were erased from the American landscape by hatred and intolerance of the white dominance. Let us dive in. Number 11, Philadelphia. The Philadelphia catastrophic event, also termed the 1985 Move bombing, took place on May 13, 1985. On this day, the city of Philadelphia witnessed a catastrophic event that left an indelible mark on its history. The Move organization, a black liberation group, had been occupying a row house in West Philadelphia for years. The group's very loud and public quest for racial justice, as well as its strong views on animal rights, led to a number of confrontations between Move members and their West Philadelphia neighbors, as well as with Philadelphia police. One such confrontation was the one that happened on May 13, 1985. The Philadelphia Police Department, armed with warrants, attempted to evict the group. The situation quickly escalated, and in a shocking turn of events, a police helicopter dropped a bomb containing C4 explosive and Tovex onto the roof of the building. The resulting explosion and fire engulfed the house, trapping those inside. This incident would spark widespread outrage, calling for accountability. The city's leadership faced intense scrutiny, leading to significant changes in police department policies and procedures. However, this would not measure up to the damage done. Lives have been lost. The Move bombing was a horrific tragedy that claimed the lives of 6 Move members, including 5 children and 3 of their neighbors. One of the children who burned was a 12-year-old little Phil Africa. 7 years earlier, his 3-week-old brother had been killed after being knocked out of his mother's arms and crushed during an altercation with police. After the bombing, a fire broke out that claimed 61 surrounding buildings and left 250 people homeless in the middle-class black neighborhood. The houses that were built to replace them were tissue paper, shoddy, and the contractors tasked with replacing them served jail time for misusing the rebuilding fund. By the mid-2010s, more than half of the rebuilt homes sat boarded up, purchased by the city for $150,000 each. Number 12, Quindaro, Kansas City. In the early 20th century, Kansas City had experienced significant growth, driven by its strategic location at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. The city became a major transportation hub, with railroads, highways, and rivers connecting it to other parts of the country. African Americans migrated to Kansas City from the rural South, seeking better economic opportunities and fleeing racial violence. They established vibrant communities, including the Quindaro neighborhood, which became a center of African American culture, commerce, and entertainment. The community also boasted a strong sense of pride and self-sufficiency, with numerous civic organizations, fraternal groups, and cultural events. Despite this progress, African Americans in Kansas City faced significant challenges, including racial segregation and discrimination in housing, education, and employment, limited access to health care, social services, and government resources. These systemic issues made the community more vulnerable to the devastating impact of the 1951 flood, which ultimately destroyed the thriving Quindaro neighborhood and displaced thousands of African Americans. The flood was a devastating disaster that ravaged the city, particularly the African American community, due to the racial hatred and discriminatory practices of the white dominance. The flood was caused by a combination of heavy rainfall and the failure of the city's levee system, which was intentionally designed to protect white-owned businesses and properties while leaving the black neighborhoods vulnerable. On July 12, 1951, the Kansas River began to swell, and by July 13, the water had overflowed the levees, inundating the African American community of Quindaro, Kansas City, Kansas. The floodwaters destroyed hundreds of homes, businesses, churches, and properties, leaving thousands of people homeless and without livelihoods. The flood was not just a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe fueled by racial hatred and segregation. African Americans were forced to live in the low-lying areas, devoid of proper infrastructure and flood protection, making them easy targets for the raging floodwaters. As the waters rose, panic set in, and people scrambled to escape the deadly deluge. Many were trapped in their homes, churches, and businesses, unable to flee. The screams of those seeking help were drowned out by the roar of the floodwaters. The floodwaters ravaged the community, destroying everything in their path. Homes were reduced to rubble, businesses were washed away, and churches were left in ruins. The once thriving African American community was now a scene of utter devastation. Many perished in the disaster. Over 1,000 people were injured, and thousands more were left homeless. The floodwaters receded in July 20th, 1951, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. In the aftermath, African Americans faced significant barriers in accessing aid, resources, and support. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and other government agencies provided minimal assistance, leaving the community to fend for itself. The 1951 Kansas City flood was a stark reminder of the racial hatred and discrimination that African Americans faced in the United States. It was a disaster that could have been mitigated, but racial segregation and discriminatory practices made it a catastrophe. The legacy of this event continues to impact the community today, serving as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality. 13. The city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast in August 2005, was one of the most devastating natural disasters in U.S. history. Hurricane Katrina's fury began to unfold on August 23, 2005, as a tropical depression formed in the warm waters of the Bahamas. Over the next 2 days, the storm intensified, earning its name Katrina as it strengthened into a hurricane. On August 25th, Katrina made landfall in southern Florida, bringing heavy rain and strong winds to the region. However, it was only a glimpse of the devastation to come. As Katrina entered the Gulf of Mexico, it began to intensify, fueled by the warm waters. The storm's power grew, and its category rating increased. By August 28, Katrina had become a Category 5 hurricane, the highest rating on the Saffir-Simpson scale. On August 29th at 6:10 a.m., Katrina made landfall in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, just southeast of New Orleans. The storm's winds howled, and its storm surge crashed against the city's levee system. The levees, weakened by years of neglect and poor maintenance, began to fail. Water poured into the city, flooding homes, businesses, and streets. Panic set in as residents realized the severity of the disaster. Chaos erupted, with reports of looting, violence, and desperation. August 30 became the day of peak flooding, with waters rising to as high as 20 feet in some areas. The city was submerged, and its people were trapped. As the storm slowly moved inland, its winds weakened, but the damage was done. Katrina began to dissipate on August 31st, leaving behind a trail of destruction, death, and despair. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, the true extent of the devastation became clear. Over 1,800 lives were lost, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. Millions of people were left homeless along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina caused approximately $161 billion in economic damage. The city of New Orleans was forever changed, its culture, economy, and people scarred by the storm's fury. You may be wondering how a natural disaster like this can be linked to racism. However, the truth is that the failure of the city's levee system, combined with the storm's powerful winds and rain, resulted in catastrophic flooding, which might have been minimal if the city's drainage systems had been working effectively. Furthermore, the slow response from government agencies was also a contributing factor. 14. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's past is marred by a tragic event in 1906, when racial animosity erupted into disruption. The violence erupted on September 22nd to September 24th, but the underlying tensions had been building for years in the post-Reconstruction era. Economic competition and resentment between African Americans and whites had been simmering, fueled by racial stereotypes and prejudices. The spark that ignited the powder keg of racial animosity was a series of false accusations of African American men assaulting white women. On September 22, 1906, a local newspaper, the Atlanta News, published sensationalized reports of alleged attacks on white women by black men, which further inflamed the already tense atmosphere. However, the main event that led to the annihilation was the confrontation between a white mob and a group of African American men at the 5 Points intersection in downtown Atlanta on the evening of September 22nd. The white mob, fueled by rage and misinformation, began attacking African American men and businesses, leading to a wave of violence that spread throughout the city over the next 2 days. Within a few hours, rumors had spread around the town and white mobs quickly formed. The mobs rampaged through African American neighborhoods, attacking homes, businesses, and individuals with impunity. The streets ran red with blood as the death toll mounted. The violence was indiscriminate, with men, women, and children all falling victim to the white mob's wrath. Many more were injured, with estimates ranging from 150 to 300, their bodies battered and bruised from the relentless attacks. As the city descended into chaos, many African Americans were forced to flee for their lives, abandoning their homes and businesses in a desperate bid to escape the carnage. The streets ran red with blood, and the sounds of gunfire, screams, and shattering glass filled the air. The city's leadership failed to intervene, allowing the violence to escalate. Governor Hoke Smith and Mayor Evan Howell were slow to respond, and when they finally deployed militia, the damage was already done. The rioting subsided, but the trauma lingered, leaving deep scars on the community. The investigations were half-hearted, and no one was held accountable for the atrocities. The decimation marked a turning point in Atlanta's racial dynamics, solidifying white supremacy and suppressing the progress of African Americans. Prominent black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington spoke out against the violence, but their voices were drowned out by the cacophony of racism and hatred. After the heat of the mass killing, the city was left to pick up the pieces of their broken community, their trust in the system shattered by the authorities' slow response and lack of action. In the aftermath, the city's leaders struggled to come to terms with the scale of the devastation. Official reports were sanitized, and the true extent of the violence was downplayed. But the African American community knew the truth. They had been targeted, and their lives had been forever changed by the hatred and violence that had been unleashed upon them. 15. Memphis, Tennessee. The Memphis, Tennessee annihilation was a devastating event that occurred in May 1866. It was a brutal display of racial violence perpetrated by white mobs against African Americans. The city, still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War, was a volatile mix of racial animosity, economic competition, and political unrest. On May 1st, 1866, a seemingly minor confrontation between white police officers and black soldiers sparked the violence. However, it quickly escalated into a full-blown riot as white mobs comprising of police officers, firefighters, and civilians descended upon the city's black residents, soldiers, and sympathizers. Over the next 2 days, the mobs wreaked havoc on the city, leaving a trail of destruction and death in their wake. Black churches, schools, and homes were torched, and their occupants were beaten, shot, or lynched. The streets ran red with the blood of innocent victims. As the white mobs showed no mercy in their rampage, a joint congressional committee reported 75 persons injured, 100 persons robbed, 5 women raped, 91 homes burned, 4 churches and 8 schools burned and destroyed, and $17,000 in federal property destroyed. Hundreds of blacks were jailed, and almost all other freedmen fled town until the carnage ended. For 2 days, white mobs, which included policemen, firemen, and some businessmen, attacked the freedmen's camps and neighborhoods. The riot had begun, after an alarm went off that African American soldiers from Fort Pickering on the south boundary of downtown Memphis had killed several policemen who tried to arrest a black soldier. In response to the reports, Union General George Stoneman disarmed the soldiers and locked them in their barracks, leaving nearby freedmen settlements vulnerable to the white mobs that soon attacked women, children, and defenseless men, as well as the northern missionaries who served as ministers and teachers for the freedmen. The Memphis riots reflected the anger and frustration felt by many white citizens, and particularly former Confederates, who had suffered the agony of a bitter defeat at the hands of a black and white Union Army, specifically Irish immigrants who had sided with the Confederacy. They hated the freedmen who dominated the skilled and unskilled jobs that had previously served as a mechanism for upward mobility in the Irish community. Some downtown businessmen also participated in the mob because they resented the hordes of penniless freedmen on the streets. Other rioters wanted revenge for the Union occupation. The use of African American soldiers as patrolmen with power to order whites to move on was especially galling to many. Furthermore, the riots reflected the attitudes of most white citizens toward the former slaves who were then free and soon demanding equal rights. The riot led to the death of many, mostly African Americans. Hundreds more were left homeless, their livelihoods destroyed by the senseless violence. Now to the next. Number 16, Nicodemus, Kansas. The destruction of Nicodemus, Kansas was a disastrous consequence of racial terrorism fueled by white supremacy and a desire to suppress black economic and social progress. On multiple occasions, white mobs attacked the town, destroying property and forcing black residents to flee for their lives. The violence was sparked by resentment towards the town's success and the perceived threat it posed to white dominance. The attacks on Nicodemus were brutal and relentless, with white mobs using intimidation and violence to destroy the town's homes, businesses, and community buildings. Many black residents were forced to abandon their livelihoods and possessions, leaving behind a thriving community that was reduced to a ghost town. Despite the severity of the attacks, no one was held accountable for the destruction of Nicodemus. The incident was largely forgotten, and the town's legacy was left to fade away. However, the impact of the violence and intimidation continued to be felt, serving as a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality in the United States. Number 17, Mound, Bayou, Mississippi. Mound Bayou, in the Mississippi Delta, is a town founded in 1887 by former slaves, with a vision that was revolutionary for its time. From the start, it was designed to be a self-reliant, autonomous, all-black community. For decades, Mound Bayou thrived and prospered, becoming famous for empowering its black citizens. The town also became known as a haven from the virulent racism of the Jim Crow South. As Mound Bayou flourished, its prosperity and independence sparked jealousy among white neighbors who saw the town's achievements as a threat to their own status. Racist attitudes and discriminatory practices began to suffocate the town, stifling its growth and potential. The railroad, once a vital lifeline connecting Mound Bayou to major cities, was rerouted, isolating the town and crippling its economy. This deliberate act of sabotage was a clear example of how white supremacy sought to strangle the town's progress. On June 12, 1921, a racial decimation occurred in Mound Bayou, marking the beginning of the end for the town. A white horde, fueled by hatred and resentment, descended upon the town, burning homes, businesses, and crops. Many residents were killed, injured, or forced to flee for their lives. The violence was sparked by a dispute over land ownership, but it was clear that the true motive was to destroy the town and its people. The annihilation was followed by a wave of intimidation, forcing many remaining residents to abandon their homes and livelihoods. By the 1930s, Mound Bayou was a ghost town, its once thriving community reduced to rubble and ashes. The town's legacy serves as a testament to the strength and resilience of its people, who fought against overwhelming odds to build a better life for themselves and their community. The destruction of Mound Bayou was a tragic consequence of racial terrorism, fueled by white supremacy and a desire to maintain racial dominance. Number 18, Blackdom, New Mexico. Blackdom, New Mexico, a thriving African-American settlement established in 1903, was a beacon of hope and self-sufficiency for its residents. However, its success was short-lived, as it became a target of white envy, racism, and resentment. July 15, 1920, was a day of unspeakable horror in Blackdom, New Mexico, as a marauding white mob, consumed by racial hatred and envy, unleashed a reign of terror upon the unsuspecting town. With torches and guns in hand, the mob rampaged through the streets, leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in their wake. Homes were reduced to ashes, businesses were looted and burned, and crops were set ablaze, leaving the town's residents to face the unimaginable. Many innocent lives were lost, others were grievously injured, and some were forced to flee for their lives, never to return to their beloved Blackdom again. The pretext for the violence was a land ownership dispute, but it was merely a thinly veiled excuse for the true intention, to annihilate the town and its inhabitants. The mob, which comprises of local white ranchers and businessmen, had harbored a deep-seated resentment towards Blackdom's prosperity and sought to eradicate the competition, driven by a desire to maintain their own economic dominance and racial supremacy. This senseless act of racial violence marked the beginning of the end for the thriving African-American community, forever etching the date in the annals of history as a day of infamy. And the next black city on the list is number 19, Bly, Oklahoma. Bly, Oklahoma, a flourishing all-black community established in 1904, represented a shining example of autonomy and prosperity for its inhabitants. Nonetheless, its triumph was fleeting, as it became the focus of white hostility, fueled by jealousy, racial animosity, and bitterness. The white dominant saw the town's achievements as a threat to their own status. In no time, racist attitudes and discriminatory practices began to suffocate the town, stifling its growth and potential. Calamity doomed the city on October 12, 1921. The devastating event struck Bly, marking the beginning of its end. On that particular day, a violent horde of white supremacists, consumed by hatred and intolerance, unleashed a reign of terror upon the town, destroying everything in their path. The once thriving community was left in ruins, with homes, businesses, and crops destroyed. The residents, victimized by racial animosity, suffered unimaginable horrors, including loss of life, bruises, and forced displacement. The violence was sparked by a dispute over a local election, but it was clear that the true motive was to destroy the town and its people. The mob, which consisted of local white ranchers and businessmen, had long resented Bly's success and sought to eliminate the competition. By the 1950s, Bly was largely abandoned, its once thriving community reduced to rubble and ashes. The town's legacy serves as a testament to the strength and resilience of its people, who fought against overwhelming odds to build a better life for themselves and their community. Number 20, Eatonville, Florida. In the heart of Florida, a thriving all-black town named Eatonville stood tall, its vibrant community and successful businesses a testament to the resilience of its people. Founded in 1887, Eatonville was a beacon of hope and pride, a place where African Americans could build a better life for themselves. But beneath the surface, a cauldron of white envy, racism, and resentment simmered, waiting to unleash its fury upon the unsuspecting town. As Eatonville flourished, its success sparked jealousy among white neighbors, who saw the town's achievements as a threat to their own status. Racist attitudes and discriminatory practices began to suffocate the town, eroding its foundation and setting the stage for a catastrophic event that would change the course of history. The construction of Interstate 4, a highway connecting Orlando to Tampa, was touted as a marvel of modern engineering. But for Eatonville, it was a death sentence. The project's leaders, driven by a desire to erase African American communities, deliberately chose a path that would decimate the town. By the late 1950s, the construction company, led by white engineers and officials, began acquiring land in Eatonville, using eminent domain to force residents to sell their properties at below-market prices. December 17, 1959, marked a calamitous moment as the demolition crew arrived in Eatonville, their bulldozers and wrecking balls poised to strike. Without warning, they began razing the town's main street, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The historic Eatonville Town Hall, the Zion Baptist Church, the Eatonville Post Office, and dozens of homes and businesses were reduced to rubble, their memories erased from the landscape. Residents, given little notice and offered meager compensation, were forced to flee to nearby cities, their lives forever changed by the devastation. The destruction of Eatonville was a deliberate act of urban renewal, fueled by racism and a desire to erase African American communities. The construction of Interstate 4 marked the beginning of the end for Eatonville, leaving behind a legacy of heartbreak and displacement that would haunt its people for generations to come. Now to the last on the list, number 21, Detroit, Michigan. The Detroit Riot of 1967 is a series of violent confrontations between residents of predominantly African American neighborhoods of Detroit and the city's police department that began on July 23, 1967, and lasted 5 days. The riot resulted in the deaths of 43 people, including 33 African Americans and 10 whites. Many other people were injured. More than 7,000 people were arrested, and over 1,000 buildings were burned in the uprising. The riot is considered one of the catalysts of the militant Black Power movement. The immediate cause of the riot was a police raid at an illegal after-hours drinking club, the site of a welcome home party for 2 returning Vietnam War veterans. The police arrested all patrons in attendance, including 82 African Americans. Local residents who witnessed the raid protested, and several of them vandalized property, looted businesses, and started fires. Police responded by blockading the surrounding neighborhood, but outraged local residents drove through the blockade. The protests and violence spread to other areas of the city as police lost control of the situation. Within the next several days, more than 9,000 members of the U.S. National Guard were deployed by Michigan Governor George Romney, along with 800 Michigan State Police. On the second day of the riot, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent U.S. Army troops to the city to help quell the violence. Unfortunately, the troops sent to quell the violence failed to intervene in attacks on African Americans, arresting more African Americans than white rioters and using excessive force against African Americans. In the aftermath of the event, 34 people were killed, including 25 African Americans and 9 white Americans, with over 1,000 injured and more than 2,000 arrested. Going forward, as the last remnants of these thriving Black communities were erased, their people were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The construction of highways, urban renewal projects, and systemic racism had not only destroyed their homes and businesses, but also their sense of community and identity. It is important to note that these cities we have mentioned to you are nothing near the actual number of Black cities and towns that were destroyed in those days. History has it that they were over 300 Black cities put to the torch. However, even in the midst of devastation, the spirit of these communities refused to die. Their people, although scattered across the region, held onto the memories of their beloved towns and the struggles they had faced together. Today, the legacy of these lost communities lives on, a testament to the resilience and strength of their people. Though they may be gone, their stories remain powerful reminders of the impact of systemic racism and the importance of preserving our collective history. In the end, the destruction of these communities became a catalyst for change, inspiring future generations to fight for justice and equality. And though they may be ghosts of the past, their spirits continue to haunt us, urging us to confront the darkness of our history and work towards a brighter future. That brings us to the end of yet another video segment. Share your thoughts with us in the comment section, and we would be honored to pick from them. Also support us by hitting the thumb button. Share video with friends and families to keep spreading these eye-openers, and consider subscribing if you are yet to. We are delighted to always have you. Thank you for watching.